This is an amazing prophecy that God was going to scatter Israel around the world, that it was going to become completely desolate for a long time, and then God in the last days was going to bring Israel back into the land. Israel came back into the land and became a nation in 1948. They were driven from the land, really in 135. 70 AD was the start of it, but in 135 they were dispersed from the land. It was made desolate by the Ottomans. During the Crusades, the Ottomans gained control of it for a while, and they salted the land. They cut down the trees. They literally made the land desolate. So the trees that are planted there today were planted. They are not descendants from trees that were in Israel because they were all cut down. They completely devastated the land. Let me read you a couple passages. First of all, the destruction of Israel. This is Zechariah 7:14. But I scattered them with the whirlwind among the nations, which they had not known. Thus the land became desolate after them, so that no one passed through or returned, for they made the pleasant land desolate. That's the first prophecy, and there's many more like that the land would become destroyed, and it did. In the late 1800s, Jewish people began buying the land of Israel again, began planting trees, began draining the swamps, began agricultural works. In Ezekiel 36:18 and 19, still the destruction and the dispersing of the people, it says, Therefore I poured out my fury on them for the blood they had shed on the land and for the idols which they had defiled it. I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed throughout the countries. I judged them according to their ways and their deeds. And Jewish people were scattered throughout the Middle East originally, even though there's none in Iraq today because of persecution. They were originally scattered throughout the Middle East. They were scattered into Europe. They were scattered all around the world. So God said he would scatter them and he would make the land desolate, and that's exactly what happened. But then he promises he's going to bring them back in the last days. When people say to me, how do you know we're living in the last days? I have no doubt, because Israel's a nation. Israel became a nation in 1948. The only nation to ever be a nation, not be a nation, and be a nation again. They spoke Hebrew. Hebrew was lost, the language, and then they revived it and they speak Hebrew again today. In Hosea 3:4 it says, For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, a prince, without sacrifice, a sacred pillar, without an ephod, or a teraphim. Those are all Jewish things. Afterwards, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord in his goodness in the latter days. They're going to return and seek God once again in the latter days. Ezekiel 38:8-9 says, And for many days you will be visited. And this is that you're apart from the land for many days, and then you will be visited. God's going to visit you. And then it says, in the latter years, here we are again, the latter days, the latter years, you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from among the peoples on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend and come like a storm. You will cover the land like a cloud, you and your troops and many peoples with you. There are 6.5 million Jewish people in Israel today. In the early 1900s, there was a few thousand. They have come like a cloud and they have covered the land. And it says they're troops. They would become militarily strong again. And there are several passages that say that. Israel is arguably the second most powerful nation militarily in the world, second only to the United States. We are the only remaining superpower in the world today. And we didn't become a superpower until after 1950, or the only superpower until after 1950. And it was interesting that in 1948, they became a nation and we supported them in their war of independence. We took a lot of the military equipment that we used in World War II and gave it to Israel in their war in independence. And some say, well, then Israel wouldn't be a nation and powerful today if it wasn't for the United States. And I might argue that we wouldn't be a powerful nation if it wasn't for Israel. Because God said, I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. And they are a land. Jesus himself said, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Jerusalem was almost barren. Mark Twain went there in the 1800s. talked about how silly and barren it was. Today, it is the capital of Israel, Jerusalem, once again, and is under Israeli control. Jesus said it would be trampled foot until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Are we at the time of the Gentiles being fulfilled? And if we are, what does that mean? Let me give you one more verse, and it talks about Israel being restored in the latter days again. This is why we call the nation of Israel, becoming a nation, the super sign of God. He's showing us that we are the first generation to have Israel in the world again since 70 AD or 135 AD. We're the first nation since then to have it a nation again. So God is speaking here to a king that he's going to bring against Israel in the future from us yet. And he says, you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud and cover the land. It will be in the latter days. He talks about them coming back in the land in the latter years, but in the latter days, this battle's going to take place. I will bring you against my land so that the nations may know that I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before your eyes. So this is the Gog and Magog war that's going to happen in the last days. Israel would become a nation in the latter years. If there was no Israel and all the other things were coming in line and we knew we were living in the last days, but there was no Israel, then you could argue that the Bible hasn't come true. You could argue that it isn't true. But because these things happened exactly as the Bible said, the Bible says Israel would be born again in a day. And in a day, when Britain said you can declare yourself to be a nation, in 1948, they declared themselves to be a nation. And they also offered the Palestinians the same deal. Declare yourself a nation, we'll give you this land, we'll give Israel that land, and the Palestinians refused. Because they said, as long as Israel is a nation, we'll fight until they're not. And the battle still goes on today. And that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that Israel does against the Palestinians. It doesn't mean that because we support Israel or we see God restoring them, that they're doing everything right. Do you agree with everything the United States does? Is there one person here I know there's no Charger owners in here, but is there one person that agrees with everything the government's doing? So we're not saying we support them. And sometimes people mistake that. Oh, you think God has restored the nation of Israel and you're happy with what they're doing here, here, and here? No, I think that's wrong, but they're people. It's just that God's restoring them. And God said that he was going to. And he's one day going to restore them to himself.